And now in section 12.2, let's go to the task of actually annotating and performing our rhythms. So just to reiterate what you learned from the last video, whenever we have values like 0.25 or 0.75, things like that, we're going to need that most precise ruler, which is this: 1 eanda, 2 eanda, 3 eanda, 4 eanda, if we're counting to 4, or just select up to whichever number of beats you need for a given time signature. And as usual, we're going to write the durations of the notes above, and we'll do the counts, in other words, all of those 1 eanda, 2 eandas below the rhythms. And our practice is to not underline counts for rests. So let's take a look at this example here. What we have on top are the values of the notes. So let's break this down a little bit. Here, this first note, notice how it has a stem and it has a beam that's connecting it to the other notes in that first grouping. So this is an eighth note, so it gets 0.5 of a beat. But that beam connects us to two 16th notes. So notice how they have two beams between them. And since these are 16th notes, they each get 0.25 of a beat. Now this next grouping, all of these notes here, each one of those notes is a 16th note. That's the standard grouping of 4 16th notes together. Each one gets 0.25 of a beat. Next, we have a dotted eighth note. So notice how it's certainly got the note head, it's got the stem, it's even got a beam that's connecting it to the next note. A single beam, I should add, and it has that dot. So dotted eighth note, indeed, gives you a value of 0.75. And now this one here, looking carefully at the last note of the measure, certainly it has a note head, it has a stem, and it actually has two beams associated with it. So it is a 16th note, which means it gets 0.25 of a beat. Now here's something to look out for whenever you're doing rhythms with a bunch of these 16th notes. Still keep in mind that you can have pretty long note values occasionally. So here we've got a dotted quarter note, which is still worth 1.5, eighth note on its own, 0.5, and then we have kind of the reverse of what we had at the beginning of this example. We have two 16th notes. Notice how they have the two beams connecting them, and then followed by one eighth note. It only has one beam connected to it. So 0.25, 0.25, and then finally 0.5. All right, now we're going to go to the annotation part, or the counting part, I should say. And this is where we realize, well, given all of those values on top, we've got 0.25s and 0.75s, all of that stuff, that means we're going to need to use the ruler that we talked about just a moment ago. So 1 eanda, 2 eanda, 3 eanda is all we need here because we're in 3/4 time. We only have 3 beats to account for in each measure. So one way to think of these counts below is that this, for instance, this is all of beat 1. These 4 syllables together represent beat 1. And so if I were to divide beat 1 into halves, like this would be the first half of beat 1, this would be the second half of beat 1. But now, given that we have 4 syllables, I can divide the beat into fourths. So 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. So again, this is giving us a greater level of precision. So let's check out what is actually happening in this example. Here we have half of beat 1 accounted for. So the 1 and the E go to that eighth note over here. 16th notes, each 16th note gets 0.25 of a beat. So 1 out of the 4 syllables for beat 1 for each of those notes. Then these are easy. Those are 16th notes. That's exactly what we expect. 1 syllable to each 16th note. Then here, check this beat out. So within beat 3, 0.75 of that beat is taken up by the first note, and 0.25 of the beat is taken up by the second note. So that means 3 out of the 4 syllables go for the first note, and 1 out of the 4 goes for the second note. Now, this next one, again, don't freak out. If you've got a particularly long note, you'll occasionally encounter these. So here we've got a dotted quarter note which lasts for 1.5 beats. That means it takes up all of 1 and half of beat 2. So it gets 2 out of the 4 syllables of beat 2, and certainly all of the 4 syllables of beat 1. Then we have an eighth note on its own. It gets the remainder of beat 2. And then here we have 16th, 16th, 8th. So that is our annotation pattern. And what I'm going to do now is I will perform this. I will count and I'll snap just so that you can hear it clearly in the microphone. So again, I will snap whenever an underline begins. Here we go. 1E and 2E and 3E and 1E and 2E and 3E and 1E and 2E and 3E and. So let's do at least maybe one or two of these examples towards the bottom of the page. So we're starting from scratch here. As always, work on the top first. And here you may want to tilt your piece of paper so you can write in a slanted fashion. That way you can squeeze more information in. So that's an eighth note. That's 0.25. 0.5 for the eighth note, 0.25, 0.25 for the 16ths. One full beat there. And then, yes, I realize this is tedious. You won't have to do this forever. But this just trains you to associate notes with values. 2 eighth notes, 0.5 each. Then we've got a dotted eighth note here. So 0.75. A 16th note. Notice how it has two beams. Then the same rhythm again, 0.75, 0.25, and then finally a bunch of 16th notes, followed by, at the very end, a quarter note. So since you've got a bunch of 0.25s and 0.75s and whatnot on top, that means you need that 1-ianda, 2-ianda system. Now, how far are you going to count in each measure? Well, you're going to count to 4. So 1-ianda, 2-ianda, 3-ianda, 4-ianda. And here's a pro tip. Often you will see, just in terms of a best practice, notes that together add up to one beat will be beamed together. So for instance, you can kind of eyeball it. Like these notes here, they add up to one beat. These notes here, they're all beamed together. They add up to one beat. So as you pencil in your counts below the music, you can kind of eyeball the groupings of the notes and guess where all of the beats are going to go. So for instance, 1-ianda, 2-ianda, I know that 3 is probably going to happen right there at the beginning of that grouping. 4-ianda, make sure never to forget your iandas once you get to beat 4. Then same thing here, we've got a group there, another group there for beat 3, and then again, beat 4, make sure you get all of the syllables in. So now, just comes the task of underlining our counts. So 0.5 of a beat means we get 2 out of the 4 syllables, then 0.25, 0.25, a full 1 beat for that quarter note, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.5, 0.5, so half of beat 4 for each of those eighth notes, 0.75, so 3 out of the 4 syllables, then 0.25, 0.75, 0.25, then 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, and then finally a long 1. So all 4 syllables within beat 4. Let's hear how this one goes. So I recommend you clap and count and also try conducting in time. So I will count and snap. Here it goes. 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and. Let's do maybe one more together. So letter B. I'll go through this one a little bit more quickly. Get your numbers on top. So eighth notes, a bunch of 16th notes, all of them, or each of them getting 0.25, 1.5, 0.5. Then here we have 2 16th notes followed by an eighth note. And then we have an eighth note followed by 2 16th notes. But you can tell from the groupings that those two groups each add up to 1 beat. 0.75 for our dotted eighth note. You can see that small dot there, 0.25. Now check this one out. We've got an eighth rest. Eighth rest still gets 0.5 of a beat. We won't underline, but we will account for that value when we do our underlining. And then 2 16th notes at the very end. All right, so since we're in 2/4 and we have all of our 0.25s, we need to count 1-ianda, 2-ianda for every measure. And again, you can kind of eyeball it based on the groupings where the 1 and the 2 are going to land. So 1-ianda, 2-ianda. Here you may have to write a little bit smaller. 1-ianda. Here's our 2 aligned with that next grouping. Then 1-ianda. 2 we can probably tell is going to begin on that eighth rest. All right, now that we've got these under control, 0.5, 0.5, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. Here, 1.5. So that means all of beat 1 and half of beat 2. So 2 out of the 4 syllables on beat 2 and all 4 of the syllables for beat 1. 0.25, 0.25, 0.5, 0.5, 0.25, 0.25, 0.75. So 3 out of the 4. 0.25. Then here, this eighth rest takes up half of a beat, or 0.5 of a beat. So we're going to leave the 2 and the E without an underline, and then we'll come sneaking in with these 16th notes at the very end. So here's how this one goes. A 1 E and a 2 E and 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 a. So a little bit more challenging to perform by the very end, but something that you certainly can do, and hopefully you understand all of the annotation techniques that we've covered. I recommend that you go to the next page and complete all of these remaining exercises, and certainly try your hand at clapping and counting and conducting and tying.